Hey guys, welcome to the question video. If you want to leave us a question, details on how to do that is down below, as well as a link to our Patreon if you want to support what we're doing. And if you want to support what we're doing, but you don't want to go to Patreon, we are now offering channel memberships. So if you want early access to the podcast or bonus content every single week, you now have the option of channel membership. So definitely check that out if you are interested. So this week's question is something that's been coming up a lot, especially the last couple weeks, and it's something that I wasn't going to talk about here on these question videos because Coda and I actually did a long-form podcast addressing this topic that will be coming out in the next couple weeks. And that is the question of who spanks the head of household? What happens if they mess up? Why is this so one-sided? I've gotten that question, like I said, at least half a dozen times in just the last week and a half. It seems to be a very common question, and for good reason, because that is kind of a hard concept to wrap your head around, especially if you are kind of just coming across the topic of domestic discipline. I honestly think that if you are asking this question, it is indicative that you are not in a domestic discipline relationship. Because once you are in a domestic discipline relationship, you really do start to have a better understanding of the structure of domestic discipline to where you don't ask these types of questions. But we're going to get into it because it is something that I think a lot of people are curious about. Obviously, it keeps coming up. So, easy answer, no one spanks the head of household. He's the head of household. He's the one that holds authority. So the head of household holds the authority in the home and in the relationship. And so it would never make sense for the taken in hand to hold him accountable in the same way that he holds her accountable. That would be like asking children what they do to their parents when they mess up. That's just not a natural function of that relationship. Children are under the authority of their parents. A taken in hand is under the authority of her head of household. So she does not have the authority to hold him accountable, to punish him, to offer that level of oversight over him, because that is just goes against the nature of the relationship that they've established. There's a level of input that the wife does give her husband. But at the end of the day, when decisions need to be made, when structures are formed, it is up to the head of household to hold that authority, to make those decisions, to set those structures, to set those standards, and it is up to the taken in hand to follow those rules, to follow those standards, to meet those expectations. And because the head of household holds authority, he builds in a system to hold the taken in hand accountable to that authority. And that takes place in the form of punishment. Because a taken in hand does not have the authority to have oversight of the head of household, it would never make sense for her to impose punishment onto him. That is just the nature of how domestic discipline functions. That doesn't mean that head of household is void of consequences. It just means that the consequences don't come from the taken in hand. And as a taken in hand, I don't have to worry about what is happening to my head of household in the event that he makes a mistake. It is not my concern to make sure that he is suffering the consequences of those decisions. It is not my job to oversee and make sure that those consequences are happening. So I don't need to concern myself with that because it's not in my role and it's not in my position to be concerned with that. A head of household, when they assume the position of authority in the relationship, They are taking on the responsibility of leadership. That's not something to be taken lightly. Their position is one that requires a lot of responsibility. It requires a lot of integrity, and it requires a certain reverence of how they approach what they're doing. So most head of households understand the weight of responsibility that they are assuming in the relationship when they decide to become a head of household, when they decide to take on the responsibility of leading their home, of leading their wife, of leading their taken in hand, and offering that oversight to her, holding her accountable, offering those consequences and those punishments. He understands the responsibility of that, and he understands that it takes a lot of effort, not only to set those standards and oversee that those standards are being met, but also to have the discernment to know when to hold accountability, how strict to be, when to maybe look at the situation and make a decision that offers some leniency and offers some grace. And most head of households don't take that lightly, and they understand the gravity of their position. So these are not selfish guys that are just flippantly making decisions that are self-serving. They really do understand the responsibility to the entire family, the entire household, to make decisions that are reflective of what is good for everyone, what's good for their taken in hand, what is good for the household. They understand that they are responsible to make decisions that serve the bigger picture, that serve what is best for everyone. Sometimes that means making a decision that is good for them. Sometimes that means making a decision that actually isn't good for them, but it's good for everyone else. And so when we look at what happens when a head of household messes up, that's almost like saying that you are expecting a head of household, expecting a husband to be selfish and to be self-serving in their role and to use their position of power to impose authority in a way that is oppressive towards their taken in hand. And that's just simply not the case. If that is happening, that is beyond the bounds of domestic discipline, and that really goes into a relationship that requires more counsel, outside counsel, to get back to a healthy place. That's an unhealthy relationship if that's happening. And it is important to be able to recognize that that's happening, to be able to get those outside resources involved. But when we talk about domestic discipline, we are talking about good relationships where everyone understands the responsibility of their role, everyone has integrity, and things are going well. Now, I did mention that a head of household is not void of consequences. So where do those consequences come from? Well, number one, a head of household has to hold himself responsible. He has to understand that any standard he sets, any rule he imposes on his taken in hand, he needs to lead by example, by following those standards, by following those protocols, by following those rules himself. So he has to hold himself to a high standard if he's going to hold a standard for his taken in hand. So it is up to him to recognize when he makes a mistake and to do whatever he needs to do to make that right. So if he makes a mistake that involves or affects his taken in hand, then he needs to go to his taken in hand. He needs to apologize if that's appropriate. He needs to make amends in whatever way serves their relationship and is appropriate for the situation. A head of household is also held responsible by the natural consequences of the situation. There are natural consequences of poor choices and bad behavior for a head of household from the standpoint that they may need to go through some disciplinary action at work in order to continue to provide for their families. And so there are natural consequences in the workplace and in society where head of households have to be accountable. Also, they're accountable to the legal system, as we all are, but they don't get to function outside of the judicial system. So there are checks and balances in place that if a head of household is making poor decisions, if they are messing up in a way that could be considered an issue of legality, there are systems set up in our society that they will be held accountable for that. So a head of household is not just running around with a free pass to do whatever he wants without any consequence at all. Domestic discipline only works when both people are approaching their roles in a way that honors the other person and honors the relationship structure. Domestic discipline is a hierarchical relationship. It places the head of household in a position of authority, and it places the taken in hand in a position of submission. There is a structure to it. The taken in hand does not hold authority. It is not equal. By design, the head of household offers the oversight, offers the direction, offers the leadership, guides her, directs her, and gives that accountability and punishes when necessary, but also encourages and builds up. It is never going to be the taken in hand's job to offer accountability to the head of household in a domestic discipline relationship, because he has authority and oversight over her. She does not have authority and oversight over him. In these relationship structures where you have authority and leadership, and then you have the taken in hand coming under that leadership, submitting to the authority, you are going to see a kind of a one-way street of accountability being held. And that's by design, and that is the way we want it. And that's part of the reason we choose this relationship structure, is to have those differential roles in our relationship, is to have that authority in place, and is to be able to yield to that authority. And there really is beauty in having these roles and having them work together in this way. Whenever somebody asks me that question, like, where does the head of household get his consequences? Who gives him a spanking? Number one, like, he doesn't get a spanking. Like, that's not his consequence. And number two, I never know how to really answer that, because I don't bother myself with understanding where his consequences come from and what they are, because it's not my position to oversee those consequences. So it's just not something I bother myself with. So anyway, I hope that clears that up, gives my opinion, gives you a perspective of my thoughts on that subject. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you guys think about this? And how does this work in your relationship? Anyway, we will talk to you next time.